Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomuda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupari Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhutanvan Premarasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamater Guti Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam Dantoyer Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Iha viharati Radha Krishna Kunjadikari Tarubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujanageya Krishna Dasa Videya Param Akila Gunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Huilo Morachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya Charit Krishna Upajive Priti Janibe Raserariti Shuni Lei Borohoihit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Muda Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, and Shri Raghunath, a graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Sri Chaitanya Lila, wherefrom the very essence of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions, Sri Krishna Das Kaviraja Goswami Pad. Again today we absorb ourselves in discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And we resume here in the Madhya Lila, the Sanatana Shiksha, chapter 22, in discussion of the Abhideya, and more specifically of Sadhana-bhakti, and more specifically Vaidhi-sadhana-bhakti. So in our last reading, we looked at the last of the verses that is cited in this section to evidence or illustrate the nature of Vaidhi-bhakti, this well-known statement from the Padma Puran, Smartabhya satatam Vishnur vismartabhyo najatu chit Sarve vidhi nishedhayur itayor eva kinkara. Vishnu is to be remembered continuously and is never to be forgotten. All injunctions and prohibitions should be servants of these two principal directives. So as we've discussed, Vaidhi-bhakti is defined as that type of sadhana bhakti wherein the inclination to enact it comes from the ruling of the Shastra alone and not from raga or ruchi or lobha for a raga. So this statement here of the Padma Puran is an injunction in the Shastra saying one should always remember Bhagavan and never forget him. So someone who then engages in the practice of remembrance of Bhagavan continuously, based on this injunction, or motivated by this injunction, can be said to be a person practicing Vaidhi-bhakti. And we looked also about how Jiva Gosvami most broadly construed the Shastra's Abhideya as Sammukya, or Unmukata, simply facing the Paratattva, or being intent upon the Paratattva, and that can incorporate both the path of Gyan and the path of Bhakti, but that more specifically it is the Shastra's Abhideya is Bhakti, more specifically Uttama Bhakti, and more specifically then varieties of the sadhana form of Uttama Bhakti, one of which is Vaidhi-bhakti. So because this injunction of Vaidhi-bhakti to always remember, or in other words, always be unmukh, or always be facing and aware of Bhagavan, is an injunction for the very thing which is the Abhideya, then we can understand that this thread, goes all the way through, and that the purpose of all the other injunctions in the Shastra, the ultimate purpose of all of the guidance that the Shastra gives, is to lead people towards reaching this state of continuous absorption and remembrance of Bhagavan. With the idea being that by engaging in such remembrance, the sanskar for bhakti will be nourished, and the sanskar for non-bhakti will wane. And as the sanskar for bhakti deepens, as the sanskars for other things wane, then there will gradually be a increasing fixity and one-pointedness of both one's thoughts, words, and deeds in alignment with one another, and all directed towards the point that is Bhagavan. So, although the Shastra also contains moral instructions or social guidelines for social governance or things like that, someone might say, well, we need those things. If we don't have, guardrails on society, people will do all kinds of crazy things or exploit one another ruthlessly or what have you. So we can say that fundamentally these spiritual principles are also the premise by which all quote-unquote natural moral behavior can come about. In other words, it's one thing for someone to have their lots of desires to do immoral things, but to refrain from doing them just because they're afraid of going to jail or they're afraid of the consequences of committing those acts. The forces of society can keep people in check in that way, but as we see, that doesn't really produce any lasting ultimate safety for everyone, or lead someone towards a true state of well-being. It's only when the psyche itself becomes reconditioned and the actual quote-unquote natural inclination, in other words, the inclination that just comes to someone as a result of the way their psyche is attuned, until that becomes something that is focused upon Bhagavan, focused upon a spiritual end, integrated with the principle that the presence of Bhagavan is there in all living beings, and therefore every living being is to be respected, and therefore is not to be exploited or, disrespected and so forth. Until that type of awareness comes, there won't be what you can say natural moral behavior and in activity which is spiritually focused in a quote natural way. So to lead people towards that state where those things can become what their mind is inclined to do anyway, these injunctions, these guidelines, and so forth are all there, and they're all necessary. So what's valuable about this teaching that we discussed last time, and we'll finish today, is this way of seeing the holistic process that all of these sets of teachings for persons at different strata and persons at different stages are all ultimately pointed at, and the ultimate aim that they're trying to achieve, the state of being that they're trying to lead people to. So, understood in this way, it's clear that all injunctions and prohibitions should be servants of these principles of remembering Bhagavan and not forgetting Bhagavan, because true remembrance of Bhagavan, true non-forgetfulness of Bhagavan will automatically translate into not only moral behavior, but spiritually exalted behavior, and ultimately prema, insofar as Bhagavan is a most wonderful object who elicits a response called prema within those who perceive his qualities, who perceive his sweetness and so forth. So by giving people directives towards becoming focused upon that object which will naturally enkindle such desire, such expression from within oneself, is a way of steering people towards something that can't be directly enjoined. In other words, you can't force someone to love or to like something, but you can tell them to spend time with that object of love so that just by the qualities of that object, they start to love the person. In other words, you can't force it, but you can, so to speak, force or direct the people to enter into the environment or the circumstances where that becomes the natural outcome. So, anyway, this is some framework and some perspective on what we discussed last time. So I'll pick up from where we left off in the commentary, where we'll look at, you could say, a further step to this perspective, which is presented by Narottam Das Thakur Mahashai in his Prem Bhakti Chandrika. So we left off with the quotation from the beginning of the Bhakti Sandarbha about the Abhideya being Samukya. So the next paragraph following the explanation of that is where we'll start. So roughly in the middle of that PDF, dated from last week. Sri Narottam Das Thakur Mahashai further encapsulates this ultimate import of the Shastra, as well as the ideal practical application of the teaching in the verse under discussion for followers of the path of Raganuga Bhakti, who foster an aspiration for Madhura Rati, in a tripadi in his Prem Bhakti Chandrika, as is indicated by the commentary of Sri Chakravarti Pad on this tripadi. So in the Prem Bhakti Chandrika we hear the following: Maner smarana pran, madur madur dham, yugala vilasa smriti sar, sadhya sadhana ihavai arnai, tattva sarva vidhi sar. So this is a very popular payar on the tips of the tongues of so many Vaishnava sadhus. Remembrance, or smarana, meaning smarana of Bhagavan, is the vitality of the mind, and a sweet, sweet state. The best type of remembrance is the couple's play. This type of remembrance is the object to be accomplished and the means of accomplishment, the sadhya and the sadhana. There is nothing besides this. This principle is the essence of all injunctions. So the idea here, one of the very sublime features of the path of bhakti, is this, you could say, overlap between the means and the ends. On the path of Gyan, there is a state to be reached, and then there's a means to reach it, and then when the end is reached, then the means is jettisoned. The analogy is given in the Bhagavatam that Gyan is like a sword, and with that sword you can cut through illusion, you can cut your way out of samsara. But once you're out, then, in other words, once you're out in a space where there's no wood to cut, what do you need a sword for? So you can jettison the sword at that point. It doesn't have any further utility. Whereas in the path of bhakti, the very thing that one does as the means is also the very thing that one does as the end. To engage in acts that are pleasing to Radha and Krishna, this is the means, and to engage in acts that are pleasing to Radha and Krishna, this is the end. This is what someone aspires to. This is what is ultimately satisfying to someone. So the sadhana and the sadhya are one and the same, insofar as the activities may be of similar constitution, but they're not entirely identical in the sense that the bhav, or the feeling, or the experience of doing the two is greatly different in the sadhya state in comparison to the sadhana state. So there is undoubtedly a vast distinction between the two, but not externally necessarily. In other words, the literal activities that one may do may be the same. And the general activity is in fact the same, as I explained, that to, anukulyena krishnanushilanam, is the common thread, the intrinsic characteristic of bhakti in the sadhana stage, the bhava stage, the prema stage, and so on. So here, Thakur Mahashaya says that smaran is the prana of the mind. So we'll explain it a little bit, but I'll just verbally jump into it, that, when the body has no pran, what is it? Dead. So, in other words, the mind, when it's not remembering Bhagavan, what is it? Dead. In other words, he's implying that the real purpose and the real utility and the proper utilization of the mind is to use it to be conscious of Bhagavan, to engage in remembrance of Bhagavan, and to not use it for that purpose is, to go against its ultimate potential, and in one sense to degrade it, and literally to contaminate it, in the sense that consciously engaging in other things only engenders samskaras for those other things in the first place. So he's saying, what he wants to convey with the payar to people is that, you're truly alive. Your mind is truly being utilized as it's meant to be when you're engaging in thought of Radha and Krishna, when you're engaging in meditation on Radha and Krishna. And that is madhura dham. That is a very sweet, sweet state of mind. So it itself should be understood to be the life of your mind, and to be also a very fulfilling thing. And then he goes more specific by saying that smaran is also maybe taken in general. So he says, Yugala Vilasa Smriti Sar, that the very best type of smriti or smarana, the very best type of meditation or remembrance of Bhagavan, is remembrance of Radha and Krishna's Leela. So lastly he says, E tattva sarva vidisar, this principle or this teaching, that state of remembrance of Radha and Krishna is both the sadhana and the sadhya. This is the essence of all the vidhis, all the injunctions. So this goes right back to the verse that we're discussing, that always remember Vishnu and never forget him. All other injunctions are servants of this principle. Therefore, always remembering Radha and Krishna, here taken as like the ultimate way of remembering Vishnu, that is the sarva vidhi sar, the essence of all the injunctions everywhere. So to grasp this point is to see the gist of the entire spiritual culture and texts that form its foundation. So Chakravarti Pad, in his Tika on the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, he specifically connects these 2 points, as I put in the footnote here. Vidinam kartabhya upadeshanam sar smartabhya satatam vishnur. So Chakravarti Pad is illustrating that Narottam Thakur is, so to speak, elaborating and giving for persons who, as I mentioned, do, upasana in Raganuga Bhakti with the aim of Madhura Rati. For them, this will be the very essence of the application of that injunction, which is the essence of all of the other injunctions. So, I think that's clear. The implication of Sri Thakur Mahashaya's comparison here of the presence of remembrance of Bhagavan that is, of intentness upon and ultimately bhakti to Bhagavan, in the mind, to the presence of the vital air in the body can be drawn out as follows. As a body that becomes devoid of prana falls dead and is soon set upon by dogs, jackals, and other scavengers, so the mind devoid of remembrance of Bhagavan, of intentness and bhakti, is assailed and made use of by worldly desire, anger, greed, enmity, envy, and so forth. Meaning, inevitably one strays from the spiritual path to ultimate fulfillment and instead undergoes suffering if one neglects to sustain remembrance of Bhagavan in one's mind. So it's the law of nature that space gets utilized, right? If there's some, meadow and no one mows it or builds a house on it or something like that, what happens? Turns into a forest, right? The other creatures, the other plants, they just creep in and, then gradually bigger plants grow and climax species come and all of this and, meadows turns into forests. And similarly, if you have a building in human society and you leave it uninhabited for long enough, then, some people will just come and start making use of it, right? That's what it's for. First time I ever went to India, this is totally random. I was going to university. I had a trailer up in this edge of this forest at the university, and I went to India for 3 months, and when I got back, there were 3 anarchists camped out in my trailer. And they were like, well, we heard you were in India, so, come on. Space should be utilized, right? So something like that, the purpose, if you don't use the mind to remember Bhagavan, then other thoughts are going to creep in. Other things are going to grow there, other things are going to make use of that space. So the implication here is that if we don't utilize the mind to remember Bhagavan, then the mind's definitely going to get utilized to remember other things, and that's only going to engender the samskars that perpetuate preoccupation and inclination towards those other things. So it's really a task to keep the mind engaged in what is most suitable for its focus. So the implication, thus, of the poem, or of this idea that the smaran of Bhagavan is the pran of the mind, this is meant to be, invoke something very strong. This idea that if I forget Bhagavan, it's like dying. It's like degrading into all otherness. Be it sattvic, rajasic, tamasic, what have you. That contrast, is something felt keenly by those whose hearts have been significantly impacted or impressed upon by bhakti and the samskar or vasana for bhakti. So, So then if something falls dead, what happens? Then it gets eaten by scavengers. So similarly, if the mind falls dead and doesn't remember Bhagavan, then all this other stuff just crawls in and starts eating on it. And, not that it starts, in other words, for most of us, that's already going on. That's already deeply embedded in us. It's not that we're starting with a clean slate. We're all starting with anadi karma, which has already, left us with, a certain degree of conditioning such that those things are already there. So thus the application of the teaching is to, to breathe life into the mind, or to, keep up the vitality of the mind as far as possible, such that these other things can wane away. Thus, all the various subsidiary practices and directives given throughout the Shastras are meant to be observed in such a way that they result in accomplishing the Shastra's ultimate directive of intentness and bhakti, lest one's observations thereof functionally amount to no more than ornaments on a lifeless body. So this is a verse which Bhagavad bhakti hinasya jati shastram japasta tapaha apranasyaiva dehasya mandanam lokaranjanam. The caste knowledge of Shastra, japa, and austerity of someone devoid of bhakti to Bhagavan are like decorations on a lifeless body, which are merely pleasing to the world, that is, to the public in general, but not to Bhagavan himself. So, remembrance of Bhagavan, or here bhakti to Bhagavan, this is the pran, this is the life. And if that is not there, then even these other things that might impress other people, he's saying that this is like ornamenting something that's lifeless. And something that's lifeless is not really ever, attractive or pleasing. It's really the vitality, which is the basis of the appreciability of all the other accoutrements, or the appreciability of all the other ornamentation and qualities. So, bhakti to Bhagavan, which here as we're seeing, the essence of which is continuous awareness of Bhagavan, intentness upon Bhagavan, that this is the vitality of someone from a spiritual perspective, or according to the viewpoint of the path of bhakti. So these poems are meant to push this point and impress upon us the importance of adhering to this injunction. That is what we're talking about in these comments. So as excessive preoccupation with the body and the bodily results ultimately only in the deprivation of the true self, that is, non-attainment of ultimate fulfillment for the true self, so excessive preoccupation with and improperly focused observance of subsidiary practices enjoined in the Shastra results only in deviation from the real spirit of the Shastra, that is, the absence of adherence to the principal directive of the Shastra, which is the sole means of bringing about ultimate well-being for the true self. So, for example, in the 7th canto, Prahlad Maharaj speaks about bhakti and says that in unfortunate cases, performing acts of bhakti becomes a mere means to someone's livelihood. In other words, someone might obtain an occupation as a paid temple priest and engage daily in various services to the Thakur. But if they're not careful, so to speak, or the vitality of what they're doing is not maintained, then that turns into, this kind of external ornamentation, or these external acts which are devoid of the real spirit of the purpose. Sadly, there are hundreds and hundreds of stories, ancient and modern, of persons who, work employed as a pujari somewhere and then end up just stealing stuff and running away after a while. There's no end to these kind of stories. So, what someone is really cultivating in the midst of whatever activities they perform, or even mantras that they're chanting, or, whatever they're doing, is really what ultimately matters, and really is determining where they're at. So this point that we're talking about is giving the traction on that by saying that the purpose of all the subsidiary practices and the purpose of all the injunctions is to facilitate this state of consciousness. This is where there's no way to duck out of it, so to speak, because someone might say, oh, I'm a vairagi, I'm a pujari, I'm a this, I chant this much and all that. But you can have all of that, and still end up being a crook, so to speak. In other words, whether you really are following the path of bhakti or not isn't determined by any of that, but it's where your mind is really focused and what you really desire and what you're really seeking. So, to recognize that awareness of Bhagavan and ultimately desire for Bhagavan and not for other things of the world is the living spirit of following the whole process, is essential to, separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, in the midst of all the things that can go on. So this verse that we're talking about is so essential to helping people at least grasp the concept of what the whole path of bhakti is meant to be, lest some of its cultural or external features become mistaken for its substance. And, as is indicated in the aforecited verse, improperly focused observance of the various injunctions of the Shastra may well be pleasing and popular in society in general, even though it fails to produce the primary effect it is intended to. In other words, someone might be a great lecturer, or someone might be a great singer, or something like this, and people might love it. But the person might be, giving so many talks or singing so many kirtans to make so much money, or, acquire so many followers, or whatever, whatever secondary things they might get out of it. So, to keep the focus on what it's meant to be is, ultimately of the essence. So thus popular opinion should not be accepted as a criterion for assessment of the appropriacy or efficacy of one's sadhana. So just because someone might be highly respected by society in general doesn't in any way prove anything about their standing on the path of bhakti. There's too many sad stories about that as well, of persons who were, praised to cloud nine as a Mahatma or a guru or a avatar or whatever, and then, soon enough they found doing activities that were unthinkable for people who were singing such praises. So just because someone might succeed in being expert in the various arts that are involved in the culture of bhakti doesn't necessarily mean that they've really imbibed the spirit of bhakti, or that the pran of the mind, the actual remembrance and desire to please Bhagavan, is really what is, driving them. So thus, this whole concept of Vaidhi-bhakti and Raganuga-bhakti and distilling the prabritti, distilling what is really the inclination, what is really the driving motivation for one's practice. And as Chakravarti Pad, tat chikirsha sunishchaya, that does someone really have a desire to do this that is really resolute? Or is it just motivated by, the secondary benefits they get from these things? That's really what it comes down to ultimately. And, the whole analogy of the bhakti lata and the trimming of the, unfavorable branches and all of that. All of these analogies, all of these teachings are all pressing to this particular point. So, rather, the Shastra, the discernment of highly realized persons, and one's own sincere introspection, guided thereby, should be the criteria by which one's progress on the path of sadhana-bhakti is evaluated. So the teachings that we're getting from, this distillation of the sarva vidhi sar, this should be the criterion for analysis and for introspection, as opposed to, social validation by persons who typically are, not highly educated. And as that verse goes of Samipad, Agya Janata Samanana Sanmadam, he, in his humility, expresses great remorse for having become deluded by the respect offered to him by the unknowing populace. In other words, getting a lot of respect from people who are not very educated, this is like a very intoxicating thing, a very problematic thing. So, relatedly, although he is known to have been highly acclaimed in the society of his day, Sri Thakur Mahashai's poetry is filled with the longings and lamentations of deeply sincere introspection, guided by the Shastra and the teaching he received from Mahatmas like Sri Lokanath Goswami Pad and Sri Jiva Goswami Pad, as can be observed in a verse he writes related to the aforecited, actually that should be verse, from Hari Bhakti Sudodaya. So this is just an example in the Prarthana. He says, Yagya dan tirtha snan punya karma japa dhyan akarane sab gelo mohe bujilam mone heno upahas hoy jeno vastrahin alankara dehe. Sacrifices, charity, bathing at tirthas, meritorious deeds, japa, meditation, These have all gone for naught, out of delusion. That is, because I have not observed them as they are meant to be, meaning in such a way that they facilitate manifestation into the heart of Prema Bhakti. At heart, I have understood that they have been like a mockery of what they should be, like putting ornaments on an unclothed body. So in other words, he's saying, I'm going on with all these things that are considered beneficial for persons on the path of karma or persons on the path of bhakti, but they didn't work. Or in other words, I did it all, but I didn't get the fruit that they were supposed to. Not because the activities don't work, but here, gelo mohe, because of my own delusion, my own lack of absorption in that prawn of the mind, or of that, fixity upon Bhagavan and engagement in bhakti for his satisfaction. So if one does all of these things but hasn't entered into the spirit that they're all really for, then he's saying this is like a mockery. This is like something like ornaments on a dead body. It's, the ornaments look nice, but they're not being put where they're meant to. So this is a serious point of self-analysis, which persons may, use as a tool of reflection in their own life for how they can refine their own, vigilance, or their own, the strength of heart with which they apply themselves to the sadhana process. So finally, in regard to the verse under discussion, Sri Chakravarti Pad addresses a specificity in how the all-surpassing injunction given in the verse is meant to be interpreted. So now that we've hammered this point so strongly that there should be remembrance of Vishnu always and never forgetfulness of him, then someone, on taking a very literal and practical perspective, may still have an objection. So Chakravarti Pad speaks to such a listener by saying, quote, continuously, satatam, means every day, and not rather at every moment. Because of the occurrence in the case of an interpretation of satatam to mean every moment, of the injunction's inauthenticity with respect to the characteristic of performance on account of its impracticability. So I know this sounds a little bit like a looped around way of talking in English, but in Sanskrit it flows down as like X because of Y because of Z. It's actually very straightforward, so to speak, but it just sounds a bit funny the way it comes out in English. So what he means to say is as follows. Sri Chakravarti Pad's explanation here is based on a principle, which he also refers to elsewhere, that an injunction is non-authoritative if it enjoins performance of something that is impossible to actually perform. So in other words, the whole premise of Shastriya Shraddha, the whole premise of having faith in Shastra, is that Shastra has given us capable guidance. To have, quote, Shraddha in Shastra means to think the guidance that the Shastra has given us is reliable. It's accurate in terms of telling us the right things to do, and it's reliable in the sense that the way that it's guided us to do it is also is realistic. In other words, it's what we can actually do. So this is a point Chakravarti Pad refers to it elsewhere. Ashakyanustana-kasya vider apramanyat iti bhava. So if there's an injunction, but it's impossible to ever follow the injunction, then how is that injunction going to help anybody? How is that going to do good for anyone? If you're going to give someone a guideline with the idea that it's compulsory to follow, it has to be something that they're at least able to follow. You can't give someone a compulsory injunction to do something that they just can't do. That, just doesn't work. And so if the Shastra is there telling us all these things that are impossible to do or too hard to do, that we can never do it, then we can't say that that's really valuable guidance or that's a genuine set of guidelines by which someone can live. It has to be livable. Doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean it should just be a cakewalk and not lead to any challenge, but that it has to be produce challenge, produce transformation, but not at such a degree or at such a rate that it becomes impractical and impossible for people to actually follow. It has to be in the strike zone, if you will. So this is a principle of hermeneutics. So if we apply that principle here, his rationale is that if the word satatam were interpreted to mean at every moment, then the injunction stated in the verse would enjoin that Vishnu be remembered at every moment. And because it is impossible for anyone to literally remember Vishnu at every single moment, the injunction would become an instance of enjoining something that is impossible to actually perform. In other words, if we interpreted it this way, then no one could ever go into deep sleep again. No one could ever sleep. No one could ever, think anything else at any ever second. So obviously that's just impossible. So therefore, to interpret the word satatam in a way that would give rise to an impractical injunction can't be the rightful interpretation. Since Shastric injunctions are regarded as authoritative because they never enjoined or intend to enjoin anything that is not actually necessary and possible to perform, an injunction which enjoins something that is impossible to do is never accepted as an authoritative injunction. Thus, if a particular interpretation of the words in an injunction in the Shastra leads to the conclusion that something is being enjoined that is impossible to actually do, then it must be concluded that such an interpretation is not the one intended, and another interpretation must be fostered. In the injunction, in the verse under discussion, Sri Chakravarti thus construes the meaning of the word continuously, or satatam, as every day, and not rather at every moment, since it is possible for a sadhaka to remember Sri Vishnu every day, but not possible for a sadhaka to remember him literally at every single moment. Although the thrust of the injunction is undoubtedly that one should remember Bhagavan as far as possible, meaning as close to constantly as possible. So that's my 2 cents at the end. In other words, if Chakravarti says, okay, it just means every day, then someone says, okay, so that just means once a day I remember Bhagavan and then do whatever I like. That's not the spirit of it either. That's not the intention either. It just means that daily there should be the practice of remembering Bhagavan as far as possible. This is practical. This is actionable for people. It's not impossible. So it's not asking too much, but it's also not making it so simple or oversimplistic that it doesn't actually lead to the purification of the psyche, the deepening of the bhakti samskar, all of the things that the whole set of guidelines is meant to do. So, like this, we can arrive at the rightful interpretation of the statement. Now, to conclude discussion of the essential nature of Vaidhi-bhakti as it has been analyzed throughout the commentary on the last 5 verses, Sri Rupapad's concluding statement in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu on the subject of Vaidhi-bhakti is also worthy of mention. Quote, this Vaidhi-bhakti, when endowed with predominant varied parameters, or maryada, stated, meaning enjoined in the Shastra, is called the, quote, path of parameters, or Vaidhi-marga, by some. Sri Chakravarti explains the meaning of Sri Rupapad's statement as follows. When the parameters stated by the Shastra are predominant, that is, when they firstly are the impetus for one's inclination towards bhakti, then, endowed with that, this Vaidhi-bhakti is called the path of parameters by some persons. In this verse, Sri Rupapad respectfully alludes with the plural to Sri Vallabhacharya, who conceives of 3 fundamental paths followed by all embodied beings in his work Pushti Pravaha Maryada Beda. There, Sri Vallabhacharya states that what he calls the, quote, path of parameters, or Vaidhi-marga, is established by the existence of the Veda, and that this path differs from what he calls the, quote, path of grace, or Pushti-marga, which Sri Rupapad later, in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu 1.2.309, says is a term that can be used to describe what he calls Raganuga Bhakti. So, in other words, in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, when Rupa Gosvami concludes his talk of Vaidhi-bhakti, then he says, and some have called this Vidhi-marga. And then when he concludes his talk of Raganuga Bhakti, he says, and some have called this Pushti-marga. So what does he mean? He's, as you know, it's well known, sometimes the plural is used not to refer to a plurality of people, but to refer to a singular person with respect. So Vallabhacharya, a contemporary of Rupa Gosvami, whom Rupa Gosvami met in Prayag with Mahaprabhu, and who perhaps also, had some correspondence with him when they both lived later in Braj, is respectfully saying that these two paths of bhakti that I've laid out here in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, they are also referred to by these terms, Vidhi-marga and Pushti-marga, by Vallabhacharya. So, regarding that, a comparative analysis of Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu and Sri Vallabhacharya's Pushti Pravaha Maryada Bheda reveals, however, that these two pairs of paths devised by these two acaryas are not completely equivalent in how they are defined. And thus, Sri Rupapad's remarks in these verses should be understood in the sense that there is simply a partial general equivalence between these two pairs of paths laid out in the aforementioned works, and not rather that they are identical in entirety. So, I think what I wrote is clear. In other words, if you look at how the things are defined, it's not that they're equal in all respects. So, it doesn't seem likely that when Rupa Gosvami is saying this is called Pushti-marga or this is called Vidhi-marga, that he wants readers to think that these things are completely exact, but to say that in general, what Vallabhacharya has spoken about in this way is congruent with or contains overlap or is generally equivalent with what I'm calling Vidhi-marga, and what he's called Pushti-marga is generally equivalent with what I'm calling Raga-marga or Raganuga Bhakti. But not that literally they're completely identical, but that you can consider them loosely parallel and overlapping. Moreover, these references made by Sri Rupapad and Sri Vallabhacharya's terminology were likely included by him in the text largely out of respect for Sri Vallabhacharya's work and recognition of its influence in the society of his time, and less so with the intent that the aforementioned pairs of paths are meant to be literally considered equivalent in all respects. So this is, if any, pundits out there want to, comment on this, they're welcome to, but this is my general impression. If you look at what Vallabhacharya wrote and how he wrote things and how Rupa Gosvami presented things, then there's definitely some differences also. And, that's here we can say we can take note from Rupa Gosvami that that's to be dealt with respectfully. In other words, not that this is the only path and all other paths are wrong and, but that other acaryas have also spoken about what I'm talking about using this term and what I'm talking about over here with that term, and, recognizing and appreciating the similarities or the shared appreciation that is there, while at the same time also acknowledging that differences both exist, but not excessively preoccupying ourselves with those distinctions, such that we would, unsettle the nishta of certain sadhakas, or we would be perceived as being less than respectful to other great Vaishnavas, or things like this. So I just included that bit here to conclude the discussion of Vaidhi-bhakti, because Rupa Gosvami puts that at the end of his section on Vaidhi-bhakti in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu. So, last couple of days we've discussed Vaidhi-bhakti, so now that concludes the analysis of Vaidhi-bhakti. We will come back to some finer points about its ultimate trajectory later, after we discuss Raganuga Bhakti, but as a whole, in terms of its definition, that discussion is now complete. So we'll just look, as this goes into the new file, we'll just look at one transition verse today, and then we'll conclude. Having thus defined and illustrated Vaidhi-bhakti in general, Sriman Mahaprabhu next presents an overview of the primary practices employed in the process of sadhana-bhakti. Vivida sadhana-bhakti bahuta vistar, samkepe kohye kichu sadhanam gasar. The various limbs of sadhana-bhakti are of vast extent. In brief, I will describe some of the best limbs of sadhana. So now he's entering a new prakaran. He's saying, I've explained what is Vaidhi-bhakti. I've given examples from the Shastra that demonstrate the injunctions that are the basis of it. Now I'm going to talk about specific practices of bhakti, or limbs of bhakti. And so now, for the next stack of payars and some extended discussion that will come, he gives an overview of numerous different limbs of bhakti. So then in our discussion, we'll look at how he's discussed those limbs in the Sindhu, how Jiva Gosvami has discussed them in the Sandarbhas, how Sanatana Gosvami has discussed them in Hari Bhakti Vilas. We'll try to get some meta-analysis, drawing together the work of the various acaryas to understand what these particular practices are and how they're meant to be performed. So just regarding this introductory point, Sri Rupa Pad introduces his discussion of the limbs of sadhana-bhakti in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu as follows. There are lakhs of limbs of this bhakti mentioned in Hari Bhakti Vilas, but those that are well known will be described here according to my understanding. So in other words, he's saying, I can't list all the limbs of bhakti exhaustively. You've already have the Hari Bhakti Vilas. There are so many things told there. But things that are very well known, the prominent ones among them, I'm going to analyze those. So now he gives a definition of an anga. So this term is used, limb of bhakti. So when we talk about a quote limb, what is a limb in this context, or an anga? He gives a definition. Now, the characteristic of a limb, anga, is described. One action, be it one in which numerous subordinate divisions are contained, or one that is just singular, is here called one limb of bhakti by the wise. So in other words, he's saying some of them may be compound actions, some of them may be singular actions, but both are called a limb. Sri Jiva Pad comments, one action in which numerous subordinate divisions are contained refers to ritual worship and so forth. Singular here refers to an action without any clear inherent divisions, as in the case of the limb known as taking shelter at the feet of a guru, and as in the case of the limb known as arising from a seated position, a bhuttana, and so on. Here means in the case of bhakti. So, just as there are activities which are composed of numerous intermediate activities, like cooking. You say, I cooked lunch. Well, in the course of performing that act of cooking lunch, you also opened a bag and then poured out the rice and then boiled the water and then added the salt, and you did like 100 other actions to do this one action called cooking. So he's saying that some of these limbs of bhakti are like that. In other words, if you say, I did archan, well, inside archan, you're also reciting mantras, you're also hearing mantras, you're also dressing the deity, you're also bathing the deity, there's so many things inside that daily process of archan. So he's calling that, a limb in which there are subordinate divisions, or an act like standing up out of respect when a guru or an honorable person arrives. That's a singular action. Now, from a minute analysis, you might say, well, you bent your ankle, and then you bent your knee, and then you flexed your thighs, and every action ultimately is a composite of so many other things. But we don't need to go into that level of detail. He's just saying that the act of standing up as a gesture of respect, that's just a simple singular action. That's a limb of bhakti. But then we'll also speak about certain well-known composite groups of activities as also singular limbs. So essentially, for persons who are trained in that kind of very kind of conceptually categorized way of thinking that you get in Vyakaran and Nyaya. He's just giving a token gesture of respect to people who think in those kind of terms to recognize the way that he's using the word anga. So, Sri Chakravarti Pad reiterates the points made by Sri Jiva Pad in his commentary and gives the additional example of the limb of bhakti known as kirtan, which will be discussed ahead in verse 121, having subordinate divisions like kirtan of Sri Bhagavan's qualities, kirtan of his names, and so on. So another way of categorizing it is not only with the actions that constitute the action, but the manner in which the activity can be performed. In other words, to do kirtan is to mention or to praise something. So you can also make subdivisions of it in terms of what is the object of the praise, or what is the object of utterance. Is it a name of Bhagavan? Is it a quality of Bhagavan, or what have you? So in that way you can also make internal divisions. So in the following 14 verses, an abridged summary of the 64 limbs of bhakti listed by Sri Rupa Pad in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu. Oh gosh, that's not a complete sentence. I'll fix that later, sorry. It should also be understood that all of the limbs that will be surveyed ahead can be both limbs of Vaidhi Sadhana-bhakti and Raganuga Sadhana-bhakti. The Payar under discussion thus describes them not as limbs of Vaidhi-bhakti, but as limbs of Sadhana-bhakti. The implication being that they are limbs of both types of sadhana-bhakti, namely Vaidhi and Raganuga. Although these 64 limbs are presented by Sri Rupa Pad in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu inside the section on Vaidhi-bhakti specifically, he explains later in verse 1 to 296 in the section on Raganuga Bhakti that all the limbs he mentioned earlier in the section on Vaidhi are also on Vaidhi also apply to Raganuga Bhakti. This subject will be discussed further in the commentary on verse 161 of this chapter. So, with that we come to the limbs of Sadhana Bhakti. So, starting from our next discussion, we'll dive into that, the first of which is Guru Padashray. So that will be also a topic of some extended discussion. And then one by one, we'll go through all of the limbs mentioned here in the text, and we'll look at the commentaries on the Sindhu, we'll look at the discussion in the Sandarbhas, we'll look at points in Hari Bhakti Vilas to try to grasp what is the overall viewpoint that the Goswamis have given us on how to practice these limbs of bhakti. So we get now to the practical, so to speak. If the Abhideya is the practical part of the teachings, and now we're dealing with the practical part of the practical part, the practices that we can do. But guess what? Even to do the practical bit, it requires some clear understanding of how it's meant to be practiced. Now, if you tell that to too many people, they'll say, no, I just want to do it. Well, good luck. And usually people who take that approach, after a while they realize, it would be useful to know how to do these things that I'm doing. And if I had known how to do them a little earlier, I might have saved myself a bit of time and I might not have gotten into such and such problems. So whatever the case may be, wherever we're at in the journey, to know how to practice these limbs will be highly beneficial for all of us as aspirants. So we hope that the coming discussion will give us clarity and enrich our conviction in engaging our precious time and human life in these sublime practices of sadhana bhakti. So I conclude here. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or any other feedback, please feel free to share. Yes, I see a hand.
Is it my hand?
Yes.
Hello? Yes. Radha.
Jai Shri.
Jai Radha. Thank you so much. I was wondering, I see kind of become here because Caitanya-caritamrta clearly explains mission or purpose of Mahaprabhu's appearance, and specifically managed bhakti. Now, Rupa Gosvami, and also, well, there's many other things, but anyway, I see that Rupa Gosvami presents everything from ground up, like Rupa and Sanatan. And of course, they explain Vaidhi-bhakti as well and everything in extents, but they give such a long and explicit explanations of Vaidhi-bhakti. And I was wondering if how does this translate to the actual mission or purpose of Mahaprabhu appearance? How does this fit in? Since Mahaprabhu came to primarily give Radha Bhav or Gopi Bhav and folk totally encourages or inspires followers to perform Raganuga Bhakti specifically.
Well, we can observe in the Charitamrita and the Chaitanya Bhagavat that Mahaprabhu had all kinds of bhaktas, right? Who had different visions of him. Some saw him as, an avatar of Ram, or as an avatar of Nrsimha, or an avatar of Krishna. Some, saw him in this way or that way. Some worshipped him with a greater sense of Aishvarya or a lesser sense of Aishvarya. So, and in his tours, he met persons who were Vishnu bhaktas, who were Ram bhaktas, who were varieties of bhaktas, and he encouraged all of them. So, as it's explained in these texts, there's in the process of the vasana for bhakti and the attachment to a specific type of rati for Bhagavan, as that enters and becomes impressed in the psyche, there's a period where there's some malleability to that, and there's also a period where it's now congealed, it's now set, so to speak, like the cement is hardened, so to speak. Bad example, since prem melts the heart, I don't mean to, imply that it's like rigid in a negative sense, but in the case of, reciprocating with the whole of the reality, so to speak, Mahaprabhu is, Yeya tamam prapadyante tangs tataiva bhajamyaham. Bhagavan says, I reciprocate with you how you do bhajan to me. So he has to reciprocate with everyone according to the type of bhajan that they do. And so he, we observed there were some Ram bhaktas who he praised their nishta. He didn't say, oh, don't you know about Gopi Bhav? He, was happy with their, Ram-centric bhakti. And in other cases, there were also instances where you might observe someone who had one orientation and gravitated to another. We see both. So we can take it that the Goswamis had a very broad and inclusive viewpoint. They wanted to write a system that would simultaneously integrate with the whole Vaishnava society, not alienate anyone, not, sort of oust anyone from the status of being a faithful Vaishnava, but at the same time, in the course of putting out their system and the comprehensive, inclusive diversity of activities, they also championed, so to speak, a particular bhav. But we see in the Sindhu, you don't find that so much. In other words, there's some special recognition of Madhura Rati, but you don't see that Rupa Goswami is writing his own personal statements like that in the Sindhu, or in same thing in the Hari Bhakti Vilas. There's some recognition of these ikantik bhaktas of Krishna, but at the same time you don't walk away from the text with this idea that this author was just all trying to make us become an ikantika, or make us all become a Krishna bhakta. You don't walk away from these texts with that impression. But when you read the Stavamala, when you read other, Krishna Lila Stava of Sanatan Pad, when you read other statements and works that the Goswamis give, then you can see what is their own personal mood. And we know from other commentators that, like Radha Krishna Das Goswami, that they understood this to be what Mahaprabhu really relished, just as in the Charitamrita, Mahaprabhu himself was impressed that Rupa Goswami could grasp what he was relishing during Ratha Yatra, which so many other bhaktas who were present didn't tune into. So that's also telling, that famous thing that we always hear about how special Rupa Goswami is. It's also interesting to think about the other side of it. That means there was a whole bunch of bhaktas there with Mahaprabhu, and that was just like, wink, but Mahaprabhu is not like, giving lectures to them about how they should all get it like Rupa Goswami did. He could have explained it, but yet, why didn't they know? And why was it special that Rupa Goswami grasped it? It was like, there must have been something personal. There must have been something that was like also confidential or not necessarily so openly or widely discussed. And the way that, centuries later, where we have all this theology and then people get into this like promotional mentality where they sort of weaponize the theology to convert people, or, weaponize these aesthetic principles to champion their tradition and, achieve status in society and all, it's like, that may not have been such a strong ambition on their part. In other words, really to grasp these things, or to really have some aspiration for a bhava sit within your heart. It's much more than just getting converted by a doctrine, or just hearing some theology that refutes your arguments or stumps you from saying something else. And so, yes, Mahaprabhu wanted that this very fine thing would come out. And yes, he revealed that in the heart of the Goswamis. And yes, the Goswamis wrote about that and praised that. And yes, that is extremely wonderful. And yes, it's beautiful that people can appreciate that. And gently speaking, yes, it's also endearing that even people coming from other parts of the world long later, who are in a very distant state of appreciation for any type of bhakti, are now educating themselves to the point where they're like, we know the ultimate esoteric essence of all bhakti traditions, and like even the people who've done this for hundreds of years in situ, they don't even know what we know. In one sense, this is like very problematic, but in another sense, there's also something endearing about it, or there is something to say for the efficacy of this theological system that the Goswamis wrote. But personally, and this is just my 2 cents, that these things really have to be dealt with very gently and carefully, and how any particular individual shapes their ultimate understanding of their relationship with Bhagavan, or how they want to go about sadhana, or how they want to pray, or what bhav they want to hold at their heart. That's as deeply personal a subject as anything could be. And, there should be respect for the volition that individuals have. And Bhagavan himself is very much accepting of a diversity of expressions in that regard. He's saying, however you approach me, I'll reciprocate with you with like that. He's not saying, everybody has to come become a gopi now. He's not like pressing that, so to speak. But at the same time, out of his, like we were talking yesterday in the discussion of the Rup Sanatan Stotra, out of Mahaprabhu's parama karuna, that he inspired the Goswamis to make this known, or to reveal this, that's also there. So to me, it's a two-sided equation, and there should be, relish and exaltation of that fine essence that Mahaprabhu and the Goswamis have given the world, so to speak. And there should be a way of doing that integrates with the broader existing Vaishnava tradition, the broader existing spiritual traditions of the world, that maintains also a sense of respect for the principles that pervade all of these things and the profundity of any type of bhakti. And the last thing I'll say is that another way of looking at it is that when you really want to show and prove something to be very rarefied and great, if you lay down a very comprehensive, solid foundation, that gives you a lot of leverage to make your point. In other words, and I don't mean this in any way in a deprecating sense, but if you look at how some of the other Braj Bhakti traditions have been propagated and the literature that they have literature that goes very much into the, Gopi Bhav Upasana and the Nitya Lila and things like this, but it has less of a systematic and broader integration with the overall Shastric corpus. And that can create a bit of a gap, so to speak, for persons who might be coming from the Karma Marg background, from the Jnana Marg background, or from another Bhakti tradition which is very injunction-centric. That kind of Bhakti tradition which is very much into the poetry and the rasa side of things can look unorganized, unprincipled, kind of excessively sentimental, etc. So it would seem to me that the Goswamis made a concerted effort to create that middle ground where there was a concerted theological effort to build a ramp, basically, between the existing Vaishnava traditions, the broader, Vedic framework or canon, into the Bhagavatam, and then into what you might call these esoteric meditational modalities of the path of bhakti, in a way where people could see how, like along the lines of what we're talking today, are actually a profound application of the very essence of all the injunctions that pervade the whole of the Shastra and all of Vaishnava culture. So by laying out all this stuff very systematically, they can't be kind of faulted or marginalized as just being kind of hyper-focused on something that other people don't know how to contextualize. But they've sort of built a foundation and then stories on top of the foundation to establish what they have to say on something that has, a lot of undergirth to it. So in one way, you could take their attention to detail and their breadth in this regard as ultimately for the purpose of exalting that sweet essence that they ultimately wanted people to have a chance to experience. But these are some of just my personal, opinion or way of looking at it. I'm not arguing that everyone needs to see it that way or that's the only way to see it. So I don't know if that answers your question or is satisfying, but that's what comes to mind.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you. So basically it shows that Goswamis have extensively explained the whole subject of bhakti in order to give proper understanding for sadhaka what bhakti is, right? And bhakti means Vaidhi-bhakti as well. So by explaining Vaidhi-bhakti, in contrast to Raganuga Bhakti, the appreciation for Raganuga Bhakti is more complete or better understood, I would say.
Absolutely. And also, as we'll get to, Raganuga Bhakti is a very challenging thing to do. And in the most cases, the support of Vaidhi-bhakti is also required. So even on a practical level of helping people achieve the goal, these things are I don't think that they were just writing them for the sake of being thorough. Like that's one side of it, but I think they were also being efficient. Like they wanted to lay down what would really help people in a coherent manner proceed towards the object.
Yeah. I think sometimes people may take impression that one has to, because of the volume of the content that they wrote and explained, is that one has to practice Vaidhi-bhakti extensively, and then when that's mature, then person will become Raganuga Bhakta. That kind of impression we get from some preachers, how they present teaching heritage of Rupa Gosvami. But of course, that's not the case.
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get into the nitty-gritty on
so
that bit as we go on.
Yeah, I would like to hear that. Thank you.
All right, well, if that's it for today, then we can conclude. And if we're so blessed, then we'll resume next week with the beginning of our discussion of the Bhakti-angas. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe. Jai Shri